powerful Darwinian rules that set the context when we think about the real world. We can engineer in the laboratory the level of virulence, contagion, and incubation that we want to achieve whatever objectives we want. And we can certainly easily arrange, given the map of the genome and some understanding of it, that humans have no natural immunity. And what barrier will there be to someone doing this? Well, all the information is public. The information is getting very cheap. The computers are going to be infinitely powerful for design. And the only difference between a good thing and a bad thing is simply a sequence, which may be very, very difficult to understand unless you know what the person's up to. In this context, nanotechnology is just more of the same. And they have different words for these things. Instead of a pathogen, maybe it's gray goo. Now, some people think that nanotech won't work because maybe powering it up is too hard, or replicating it, the machinery is too hard. But the people I know have talked to have told me things that make me believe that they can work around these problems. But frankly, I'm not going to talk about it because I don't know how widespread knowledge of those things is, and I don't think it helps to talk about it. So, and I would also notice that for me, we don't need to have assemblers in nanotechnology for it to contribute to the danger. Nanoelectronics, which operates, I think, mostly using self-assembly, which is a different mechanism, should be sufficient using self-assembly techniques to give us an assured 10 to the 6 speed up that gets us to the point around 2030 where I think we have a substantial danger. Nanoassemblers then would just be piling on. Now, probably the unpleasant part of this talk is then I'm going to have to talk about what do extreme individuals do with such technology. What they do is they do what we would call pestilences. And unfortunately for us, it's kind of dropped out of our cultural memory. The Black Death in the 14th century, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, was transmitted to Europeans in 1347 when a Kipchak army besieging a Genoese trading post in the Crimea catapulted plague-infested corpses into the town, being used as an instrument of war, and about a third of the population of Europe then died. Smallpox in the 16th century Americas. The turning point in one instance was involving smallpox came when Lord Jeffrey Amherst secured his place in history as the inventor of modern germ warfare by commanding, infect the Indians with sheets upon which smallpox patients have been lying or any other means which may serve to exterminate the accursed race. That's from this wonderful book by Robert Wright called Stolen Continents, which I highly recommend. The thing that some people in the country are probably old enough to remember, the last thing that really happened, I'd say, was the influenza epidemic in 1918. But what's happened in the last 50 years or so is antibiotics and sanitation have prevented many or most such things. But if people who've read books like Laurie Garrett's Coming Plague realize the antibiotics are starting to weaken. I think we have very little memory of the plague itself. I'd like to read you a quote from Lucretius about the plague that was visited once upon Athens. He says, "At first they felt their heads burning with fever, throats blackened, sweating blood, the tongue filled up, engorged with blood, became too hard to move. Men's inner parts were burning to their very bones. Their guts were furnaces. The only thing they had to drink was thirst, which made a deluge seem less than a raindrop. Doctors shook their heads while patients stared blankly. The signs of death were obvious. The mind was crazed with grief and fear. 8 days or 9 would find the limbs grow stiff in death. There seemed to be no certain remedy. What gave life to one killed others. The plague was most infectious. It could spread as pestilences do with animals, cattle, and sheep. So death was piled on death. None were left, sometimes as mourners, when the dead were hurried to their graves. Battles broke out as the survivors fought for funeral pyres with corpses heaped on corpses. Funeral rites, which these pious people held in all traditional reverence, became quite out of fashion. Everyone in grief buried his own whatever way he could amidst the general panic. Sudden need and poverty persuaded men to use horrible makeshifts. Howling, they would place their dead on pyres prepared for other men, apply the torches, maim and bleed and brawl to keep the corpses from abandonment." Okay, well, so let's change the subject. Thankfully, robotics. The threat in robotics is quite frankly different. The threat is what I would call a wild successor species, something that is really out of our control. I believe nanoelectronics probably provides sufficient CPU power. Moravec has well outlined the dangers in his book. I think it's farther out. I judge the bulk of the genetic risk to be less than 20 years out, the nano risk to be less than 30 years out, the robot risk probably 30 plus. All of these failing a kind of a Dolly 2 kind of surprise. The real thing that robotics does is it changes the evolutionary paradigm. The biological evolution has clearly been in the back seat since our arrival. It was always a very slow process. It was a kind of a tree-like branching or collapse. But now the whole thing could collapse, frankly, so that neither we nor the robots are on the main trunk going forward. It's a new game again, probably 1 million times faster. And the robots have an advantage over us, and a very distinct advantage, in that basically they're Lamarckian. They can inherit knowledge, memories, and experience, not just through the way we do, through genes and cultural artifacts. So the danger, I think, is really extremists and delusional people. I'd like to read you a quote from a neurobiologist at the University of Washington named William Calvin, who wrote in the Seattle Times the week after the Wired article came out. He said, "There's a class of people with delusional disorder who can remain employed and pretty functional for decades. Even if they're only 1% of the population, that's 20,000 mostly untreated delusional people in the Puget Sound area. Even if only 1% of these has the intelligence or education to intentionally create sustained or widespread harm, it's still a pool of 200 high-performing sociopathic or delusional techies in the Puget Sound area alone." His words, not mine. But he follows to say, try to scale it up to the world and divide by 100 for relative education. You come up with a number that's quite large. So what we're talking about here is whether we're going to give these kinds of people illimitable power. One way, it's hard to think about what that would mean, but what I think about it is, it's like Flight 990. Remember where the pilot probably crashed the plane? Just imagine if everybody on the plane is a pilot. How many, and has a button to crash the plane, how many people are going to be pilots with you on the plane before you're willing to get on? Not willing to get on anymore. And imagine the whole planet is full of pilots. How does that make you feel? It really is, I think, a return to fate as we knew it in the ancient world. We've lived over the last 2,500 years with roughly one-on-one or one-on-a-few violence. Now we have this possibility of one-to-many contagions, which enables genocide, extinction, or worse, committed by individuals in a way we've never faced before. Now, people have proposed technical fixes. Eric Drexler, for example, in his book on nanotechnology, proposes shields. The problem with these shields is essentially, primarily, in my view, an autoimmunity problem. In other words, you build a shield and the shield attacks you. To shield the human body from any potential pathogen, you basically need a perfect human immune system. I think that's unreasonable to assume. The nanoshield against nanotechnology seems like a doomsday machine to me. The shield against robotics is ultimately a perfected version of Asimov's laws of robotics. Luis Alvarez, the Nobel laureate physicist, said of the people who were trying to build the SDI missile defense very succinctly, bright guys, no common sense. And I think that kind of sums up thinking that we're going to save ourselves with a shield. Arthur C. Clarke said, "A total defense might indeed be possible in a century or so, but the technology involved would produce, as a byproduct, weapons so terrible that no one would bother with anything as primitive as ballistic missiles." So it's quite clear, I think, that shields are worse than the thing they're shielding from. Carl Sagan, in his book Pale Blue Dot, in fact, suggested that the answer to this was to head for the stars. The problem with this is there's not enough time. Many people would be left behind. Who takes ethical responsibility for them? Because the problems will be here, and actually the problems will probably follow us to the stars as well. So it seems to me this isn't a fix either. The fix that Ray Kurzweil proposes, in my mind, is sort of be one with technology. I don't think it really fixes the problem, because I'm sure these problems will exist in whatever new technical substrate that we go put ourselves in, since everything's speeded up. And you can read about the dangerous, super-intelligent, all-powerful robots in Moravec's book. Now, there are some other non-technical fixes. We could hope for a second coming. The problem with this is the way I read, I have a Bible in my bag, and that seems a little strange, but the way I read these things is I don't think God is necessarily going to intervene.